by the NSA directly in their own way in a nursing home in Jamaica, Long Island, between 1976 and 1979, where for some reason it was terminated. The man who ran this was an NSA man, and many years again, after this program was over, I happened to run into him in one of my lecture series in the South in North Carolina at a dinner party thrown by the people who had sponsored me for a lecture. And this man was a drinker. Eventually, he got drunk enough that night. He says, "Al, there's some things I got to tell you." And he told me about his involvement with the mind control programs, the Montauk Boys via NSA at this facility in Jamaica. So I asked him some of the same questions I asked those who were over me at that time. Did they ever tell you what they were going to use these kids for? And he says, "No, they would never give me any indication." Did they ever tell you when they were going to use them? And I said, "Yes, more or less." And we agreed that the, at that time, stated goal in terms of dates was around 1995, 97, where there would be the primary use of these boys. But he said, "No, I couldn't get any information out of them." And that program was folded. But I said, "Well, were they all Caucasian?" He says, "No, there were very few Caucasians in that project." And I said, "What were there in there?" He says, "We had Jewish kids, we had Orientals, we had all kinds of others, very few whites. Apparently, it was a program used to find out whether or not you could program other than Caucasian for the same end," which did prove to be true. So that the race was not important. This was apparently a chosen factor by those who ran the program at Montauk. Not essential that they be white. That was a very interesting side piece of information. Well, this program, as originally set up with very physical programming, caused a lot of problems. One of the other problems that occurred, which was very obvious in a matter of a few years, was that approximately 70% of the boys programmed there in the Montauk Boys program were programmed as homosexuals. It was very easy to shift the sexual orientation under those type of programming conditions. Why they wanted 70% or so of homosexuals, I don't know. It backfired on them for the simple reason that homosexuals get together, they create enough Kundalini energy usually that it breaks the program. So they were deprogramming themselves, and that's not what the government wanted, or those who ran the program. When I say government, understand that we all assumed at this point in time that this program was government-sponsored and government-run. We eventually found out it was not. Government used various elements of the government, departments of the government used the program in terms of the output. They did not run it. They had overseas and overseers of it, and of course the intelligence community was in on it. Along about 78, 79, various electronic techniques were developed which would do the same thing. So they dropped out this whole physical business. Because it had a very low output, many of them had to be beaten into submission because they didn't want to go through with the program, and they quite literally were beaten someone to death. And let's say the yield was not what they wanted. So along came the electronic techniques using essentially EEG-type equipment, or in reading the brain waves, of course, you put pads on the head in various locations to pick up those sensitive energies, very low-level energies, but easily picked up by the amplifiers and the pads. And this was turned around so that it became a machine like an EEG machine, but the pads were put on sensitive points of the body, including the genitalia, and energies were put in instead of taking energy out, the purpose being the use of this special programs developed and put on floppy disks, usually took 2. They would create the orgastic state by means of this machine. They could hold it as long as they wanted. And with that, of course, they could then program either verbally or by means of Pat Flanagan's machine, which I showed in a recent lecture. His patent goes back quite a distance to about 1968. The government seized it because there was a means whereby somebody could talk into a microphone through an amplifier with oscillators and certain other equipment, fairly simple. Put 2 pads on the body in any location, essentially. And that you could put on a wrist, you could put it on a chest or the back, and the person would hear the sound spoken into the microphone, even though he was not getting it through his ears. It was going through the nervous system and winding up in the auditory centers. Flanagan got patents on this. It was one of the first patents of its type. And it didn't take long for the government to recognize the potentialities, and they seized it under the interests of national security, and it took them an 11-year court fight to get it back. They gave it back and let it be released into the normal stream when they found something better. That's what it really comes down to. But by means of a machine like Flanagan's or verbal instruction directly, these kids were programmed as to whatever they wanted while in this state. Then, of course, code words were put in or numbers or whatever the keying technique was they wanted. And it's all closed off. They were told they won't remember anything, which likened them to hypnosis. You don't. Because the state was similar to hypnosis, but it was not identical. And they would be released and sent back to wherever they came from. All right, what kind of boys did they use? Where did they come from? And what was the implications of all of this in terms of, let's say, the reservoir of personnel required? Initially, the boys were taken almost off the streets of Long Island. Some of them came from rather prominent families. And quite literally were picked up physically, taken to the station, processed, and brought back. But I pointed out to them before I even became involved with the program. Early on, they wanted me in, and I refused to become part of it after witnessing one of the failed programming attempts. They picked them up off the street, and I told them, I said, you better be careful about this. Some of these kids come from prominent families on Long Island who have a lot of clout, and it wouldn't be doing the program any good for it to turn up in the Long Island Press or the New York Times. So they started picking them up at greater distances and finally focused in on homeless kids, street kids, if you will, who had no home, broken from their homes for whatever reason, broken all association, and many of them were down and penniless, broke, didn't even know where the next meal was going to come from. A serious problem in New York and a lot of other cities. So they started picking these kids up because they were quite literally homeless. When they were done programming them, they would send them back to where they had come from, waiting to be used. By 1979, with the electronic system fully operational, I went to Jack Pruitt, the station master, and said, look, we've got to change this program. You're beating half these kids to death. They're being treated very badly. They refuse to become part of it. Let's change this whole thing around. First of all, it can be done electronically now, so that cleans up that part of it. And secondly, instead of beating them into submission, offer them a carrot. Give them something. And he says, sounds good, but that's out of my reach. It's definitely out of my jurisdiction. You'll have to go higher up. I went up the line to the technical director, Dr. Herman C. Unterman, and others. Finally wound up someplace near the top for the man who I recognize today, but he is still alive, so I won't use his name, and told him what I proposed. And he says, I haven't got time for this. I don't want to hear about it. I says, well, maybe the Long Island Press, the New York Times would like to hear about it. Well, he froze at that point. He says, wait in my outer office. I got to make some phone calls. So I waited about half an hour. 40 minutes later, he pulls me back in. He says, you can guarantee this program will work the way you outline? I said, yes. He says, go ahead and do it. I says, I want it in writing that you have given me permission to do this. And she wrote up a letter and signed it. So I went back and we threw out the man who was doing the beatings and offered essentially this kind of program. They picked the guys up. They'd run through a pre-screening process. And then we'd say to them, we know most of you are homeless and have no money and can't even go back to school. If you will join this program voluntarily and become part of it, after it's over, you will not remember that you have been here and been part of it. But we will do this for you. We will give you a bank account. We will give you money to live on. It will be expected you will go back to school and finish your schooling, because most of them hadn't finished high school, and some of them weren't even quite up to high school. Go back and finish your schooling, and said if you want to go on to college, go right ahead, the money will be there. And if you want to go get a PhD and think you can do it, fine. But when you have finished your education, whatever level you decide to go to, and get into the mainstream of society and working, we will no longer feed your bank account. And you will, of course, not remember any part of this until such time as we decide we need to use you for whatever purpose it may be. Nothing was explained of what the purposes were at this point. There's about 90% acceptance, which was a lot better than something like 40%. And they went along with it voluntarily. I told them, I said, if you don't want to be part of the program, you're free to leave. Of course, you will never remember having been here. A few left. Most stayed. So the program output went up, and the numbers went up. At one point, that is in my early recovery of the Montauk memories, which was 1986, I put 2 to 2 together and came up with a number about, well, maybe we processed about 10,000 Montauk boys. That proved to be a gross underestimate, as I found out much later. But one of the questions will be, and is, of course, how did they continue to pull these people in? And in view of the fact we learned later the numbers went into the millions, how did they get these recruits? Where did they get them from? They took them from all over the U.S. Well, did they pick them up with a car and drive them there, or put them on a plane, or just capture them physically? What did they do? No, they didn't. Eventually, it came down very simply to using the Montauk Tunnel. They would go into an area, scan it. Perhaps agents would go into an area and scan it to see if there were appropriate material there for the Montauk Boys program. They would pick them up by means of the time tunnel, instantaneously transport them to Montauk, pre-screen them, see if they were part of the program, process them, and ship them back to where they'd come from. And with the capability of not only transportation physically in space, but also time manipulation, they could pick them up, let's say, at 12:01 a.m. some other morning or some day that they wanted to pick these people up. I might run them through Montauk and take a week at it, ship them back at 12:01 plus half a second. They would never remember it ever happened. There would be no indications they had ever been anywhere. Nobody who their friends would ever see that they had been missing. And they did this on a very regular basis for a long period of time. The program was removed from Montauk itself in about 1980. I was involved in it from 1979 until about 81 because not all phases were removed from Montauk. And it spread from there to 6 locations on Long Island, and every major city in the U.S. had a Montauk Boys program sometime after 83. The Montauk project collapsed on the night of 12 August 83, as I previously outlined, due to the arrival of Duncan and myself in our original form from the Eldridge. And when we were left, of course, then Duncan number 2, the reborn Duncan, was triggered in order to set loose this monster to shut down the station. The station was shut down on the night of 12 August 1983, at least on the surface. I understand from one of the people who remained on there for over a year after that some operations below decks, so to speak, continued. But then it was closed completely, rebuilt, another 2 levels added underground from what we were told, and reopened in 1987. The Montauk project continued for the same basic personnel from 1987 to 1991, doing mind control, other types of things like traveling across the galaxy with the time tunnels, doing whatever they wanted to do. And in 1991, the Air Force moved in and took over because they had a very special project in mind. I was not part of this. I only know about it through Preston Nichols, who was part of it. He was pulled back in. Operation Sky Pebbles. While this is not part of my history, it is interesting to note that Operation Sky Pebbles was the Air Force's official title in the program to divert the comet known as Hale-Bopp, which arrived in 1997-98. They knew about Hale-Bopp 10 years before it arrived in orbit inside the solar system, and of course swept around past the Earth. The reason it swept around past the Earth is because Montauk Point, using extremely powerful particle beam weapon systems, was part of the later research. And that, of course, goes back to some of Tesla's original work. We used to divert it. Now, the 2 people, of course, who were given credit for it, Drs. Hale and Dr. Bopp, discovered it 2 years before it arrived in the vicinity of the Earth. But NASA and the Air Force knew about it 10 years prior to the arrival and been tracking it because it was the largest comet known in history to approach the Earth. As it got closer, they were concerned with the fact that the gaseous envelope, over 25 miles in diameter, was filled with chlorine and methane, and if it should contact the Earth's atmosphere, it could quite literally poison the atmosphere and kill everything on Earth. Or if the cometary body itself were to crash into even the ocean, the tidal waves and the disturbance could kill approximately, by estimate, half the world's population. Therefore, there was a great deal of effort in diverting this thing when they knew it was going to approach the Earth. They had to wait and see what the trajectory was. Well, the trajectory didn't remain the normal trajectory. There were 23 course corrections. Somebody was steering it straight into the Earth. And of course, it was eventually diverted. Preston was part of it, and he could tell his own story on this as how it happened. But it was diverted by a very wide distance, slightly ahead of the original mathematically plotted and computer-generated trajectory, and left a safe distance. After it was passed, it was hit again and broken into 6 pieces, which went on out into space. With the successful termination of that program, the Air Force moved out of Montauk in June of 1998 and abandoned the base. It wasn't abandoned for long. Again, I was not part of this, nor was Preston at this time. The Navy moved in and took over the base for their own operations from that point to this day. Exactly what they're doing, we don't know, other than the underwater and underground particle beam generating systems, which are very complex and require an enormous amount of power, are still used. But my involvement in Montauk ended on the night of August 12, 1983. I was told, actually, 3 days before that date, about 9 August, to go take a hike, take a vacation, get off the base. Duncan was diverted into another area of the base for the project, so there was no possibility that either I, as Al Bielek, or Duncan number 2 could possibly meet Duncan number 1 or Ed Cameron, myself, and cause a possible time paradox. So we were kept well apart. They were aware of this possibility and avoided the problem. After the station collapsed, of course, it was no longer used until such time as I indicated. But I was never again part of the Montauk project. Aside from the Montauk Boys program, which expanded to every city in the U.S., major city, and as the Air Force later determined, sometime in 1997-98, that it was a worldwide problem, though certainly of much less intensity and usage than in the U.S., because I went to Europe on my lecture series, and I also went to Australia. There were Montauk Boys there, but the numbers were very low. Before getting into some of the other aspects of Montauk, to close off on the subject of Montauk Boys, in 1993 I met a gentleman by the name of Phil Schneider, who was a retired, by his own choice, government geologist. He was at one of my lectures up in Seattle, but his home was in Portland, Oregon area. I told him about the Montauk Boys thing, and he became rather incensed. He said, "This to me smells of pedophilia." I said, "Well, perhaps you could say that in a manner of speaking." He says, "I want to look into it." He did. He went to the Portland Police Department, asked them about it, and they says, "Yes, we've heard of the program, and we would advise you it would be best for you not to poke your nose in business that doesn't concern you." They were quite telling him, "Go get lost and don't come back." He became quite upset about that, and he went to the FBI. The FBI, he went to the office, and he met one of the people who had been in the service there over 20 years, a senior FBI man, and discussed it with him. He said, "Yes, we know about the program." "Oh, you know about it?" "Yes." "What are you doing about it?" "Nothing." "Well, why aren't you?" "We can't." "And why not?" "Because our hands are tied." This is, let me give you a few statistics. And this is where I became very interested when he came back to me, these statistics. And this is common knowledge, if you know where to look. It's not suppressed. So every year in the United States, approximately 2 million kids disappear. And this has been ongoing for at least 20 years. We investigate, of course, where we can. Eventually, we find out what happened to at least 1 million of those kids within that year's period. Some of them are found and returned to their parents, but the other million, we never find anything out about whatever. It's just like a blank slate. We don't know where they went or what happened to them. This has been ongoing for some 20 years, essentially. Well, it doesn't take too much mathematics to figure 20 years times 1 million is 20 million kids have disappeared in 20 years approximately. Suppose half of them were picked up by the Montauk Boys program. That's a very large, shall we say, a secret army under somebody's control. Well, I told that to Phil, and Phil said in the process of discussing it, he saw that possibility, but I went back to Preston, and when the first Montauk Boys programming site under Sag Harbor, Long Island, was broken into by the Air Force sometime in 1997 because of what Preston told them and the things we were doing there at that time, the Air Force got into it, and They closed the base. They got all the files and the records. Preston was allowed to see them. They had 30,000 dossiers from that one location alone, with photos and a complete history of the Montauk boy had been processed. The one came from as far away as Australia to be run through Sag Harbor. The personnel were all low-level personnel in strange gray uniforms with no rank, no bars indicating name, but strange red threads, epaulets or whatever it was on their shoulders. But the desk hardware was the most interesting. The desk pen and pencil sets all had a red rosy cross, a red rose on top of a golden cross, which could be the Rose Cross, it could be the Rosicrucian Order. We're not sure exactly what, because there are both. And further digging on part of Preston and myself indicated, so far as Preston was concerned, the Palatine monks were involved in this thing, and other groups, the Knights Malta, not the Knights Templar. And by implication, of course, the possibility of the Masonic Order. They're not making a statement the Masonic Order was involved, but there is an implication it could have been. Somebody at high level was running this thing. The religious orders were being used as a front. And as we finally learned, the government and the military had nothing to do with the operation of this program. And it was set up by the Germans. It was not being run by the German people as it went on in time. We are still to get all the answers as to who's running it, what the ultimate purpose is. Again, at that time, I got no answers as to what the purpose was and what it'd be used for, but it's fairly obvious today because all you have to look around you, as I've already said, you can see the mayhem that has been created, and particularly in terms of the school shootings, where these kids act, in some cases, absolutely blankly, a blank mind, and then are snapped out of it later. Particularly the Conyers, Georgia incident, exactly 1 month after the Columbine operation, where the kid was shooting one quite randomly in the yard, hit no one. The assistant principal came out, told him, talked him into dropping the gun, putting it down, which he did, then came up and put his arms around him, and the kid snapped like that, jolted. Where am I? What's going on? He had absolutely no recollection of what he did. This is what has been going on in all of these cases of these school shootings. One has to look a little further and understand